So we're going to move on from Saints' Days festivals to, challenges to cult communal. I'm sorry, same slide. The success of the Reformation promoted the spread of humanism. So the success of the Reformation promoted the spread of humanism with its increased emphasis on critical thinking rather than acceptance of traditional beliefs. The success of the Reformation promoted the spread of humanism with its increased emphasis on critical thinking rather than acceptance of traditional beliefs. So the Reformation and humanism eventually will challenge practices that will become obsolete. So the Reformation and humanism will challenge and eventually make some practices obsolete. But some forms of control and punishment survive past the Reformation and are used by local or church authorities. So we're going to look at real quick now are some forms of like older medieval types of control or torture. But post-Reformation, some of those social controls still remain. So that's what we're looking at here, these social controls that still perpetuate through like 1700s. First is the charivari, which is a local public mocking parade. So somebody does something like adultery or some kind of like, big time sin, public drunkenness, or whatever the case is. Or like I said, adultery or, sex out of wedlock. They would have these loud public mocking parades where they usually they would make them, they would chain them up, and they would people would march behind them with pots and pans, yelling about what they did.
So they can't have premarital sex, but they can have the blood sports.
Correct.
Yes. Just have animals.
Right. They don't have souls, so.
Okay, girl.
Girl.
Yeah.
Okay. So they would have people parade behind them, clanging pots and pans to make rough music to embarrass them. So this is a form of social intimidation and shaming. I think, for one, that we should do away with things like TOR in D.C. and do this instead. Like, have you shamed through the hallways and pots and pans clang behind you, right?
How would you like it? How would you like it?
Right?
How would you like it?
I'm the adult. I don't have to like it, right? I'm not
We
gonna.
shamed you for your sins.
What do? I'm the adult. I'm always right.
So your tests are too hard. So really, the Puritans are like, we're going to kick you out, put a letter on you, and the Euros are like, no, we're going to have fun with this.
Exactly.
They're a whole parade.
This idiot did this.
I know,
So
no,
that's a
every
thing, it's
time
like,
I'm
do your homework.
This mostly happened in small Western European communities. So this mostly happened in small Western European communities. As population grew and capitalism began to replace subsistence agriculture, the social structure that supported this disappeared with the rise of more official forms of control. So as population grew and capitalism grew and replaced subsistence agriculture, then more legitimate social controls developed, like police or courts. So as small communities got more legit and moved away from subsistence agriculture, then they behave more legit with police and courts and don't do this kind of fun stuff anymore. On that, right? I'm going to propose it to City Council.
Whatever happened to good old days?
Exactly. All right, stocks, pillory, and pranger. Stocks, pillory, and pranger.
That just sounds boring.
Okay. Stocks were a form of public punishment as well from medieval times. This is where an offender would sit on a bench and have their ankles enclosed in the wooden circles, the wooden stockyard deals. You know what I'm talking about, right?
The
Yes.
Like this,
Oh,
but
yeah.
with the feet, right?
Yes.
A lot of times they might also have their head and arms also locked in stocks too, depending. And people would come by, they would put a sign over them saying whatever they did. And if people would come by, they could yell at them, they could rub garbage in their face or waste in their face. Yeah.
Imagine going home after that, your neighbor's like, hey, how about that garbage?
Your neighbor's probably there putting the garbage in your face, right? Exactly. People would throw all kinds of stuff at you.
Can you imagine what today's world would do if they did that to a sex offender or something and they were all right, have at it
Right.
oh my god.
You said this was boring, right? You said it
Wait, I'm
sounds
sorry,
boring.
but this all happens electronically.
This is very true, right? There's a lot of
This
shaming.
happens on Twitter.
Exactly. Pillory entrapped the victim's head and wrist as he stood or walked around in an upright wooden bar. So pillory entrapped the victim's head or wrist as he stood or walked around an upright wooden bar. Kind of like this is pillory essentially.
What the heck? Are you walking?
Well, that one was where he just stood upright, but you could have it to where you just had the top bar and you had to walk around with it. So pillory entrapped the victim's head and wrists as he stood or walked around an upright wooden bar. In the pranger, the victim's neck was chained to restraints around the ankles. So in the pranger, the victim's neck was chained to restraints around the ankles and placed them in an uncomfortable half-kneeling position. So the pranger, you had chains attached around the victim's neck to the ankles, and they placed them in an uncomfortable half-kneeling position.
So can you demonstrate what that would look like?
Yeah, like basically like this, where you're like this the entire time.
I'm not taking notes. I'm just drawing pictures of what I can do.
I did too. That's why. Like,
Right.
where'd it go?
So we say things like, let's make America great again, right? Those kind of things, or make Europe great again. That's what we're talking about, right? Bringing all this back. All
I'll
right.
make sure.
Flogging.
Whenever I'm president,
Yes,
I'm gonna
this
implement
is
it on you
this is what I'm
first.
looking
Okay. For nothing. So now you're just a tyrant.
No, I know what I could do it for.
Flogging is whipping, essentially. So you might be tied into one of these stocks to the pillory or pranger, and then you're also flogged too, as you're walking around or as you're sitting there in the stocks. So often, the flogging is often accompanied by the stocks or pillory or pranger. Like blood sports and executions of the period, it drew many spectators. People like to come watch people get whipped publicly.
Did they bet on it?
Could. I mean, why not? Like, how many is going to take till he cries, right? So bet on it, right?
I'm just thinking of the 100 Games.
Yeah. It's all true. All right. New patterns of marriage. Not quite time to go yet.
We left fun stuff.
I know. All right. Well, now we're kind of moving into sort of like changes in the back half of the 1700s now, looking at changes later on. So in the second half of the 1700s, patterns of marriage and illegitimacy shifted dramatically. So in the second half of the 1700s, patterns of marriage and illegitimacy shifted dramatically. One big change was that young people were now able to make decisions about marriage for themselves over family interests. So what started to happen in the late 1700s with the rise of like cottage industry and enclosure and the ending of common lands is that now you have a bunch of people who can't work with their family anymore on the farmlands. So while they might work in a cottage, a lot of them have to end up going where? Cities. So a lot of folks might go off to the cities on their own, and basically they're out of their parents' or family's supervision now. And so this is going to lead to a lot more earlier marriages. So by the late 1700s, with the changing rural society shifting more towards urban, it's giving a lot more younger people more control of their lives now, away from their parents' oversights or family oversights. More youths in the countryside work for their own wages as well, which led to also increased freedom. So if you're also working in the rural areas for wages, it's also leading for you to have your own more freedom as well too. So youths were flocking to cities in search of work. So it led to more social contacts and fewer social controls. Because a lot of these controls we just talked about were occurring mostly in rural areas. And now all those controls of your family oversight's not there anymore. So now you're free to do what? Exactly. With whoever you want.
And so you hit the Chibra.
Right, exactly. So you have an illegitimacy explosion in the 1750s onward. So for about 100 years, there's a big birth explosion this is in the key concepts. From 1750 to 1850, there's a big birth explosion, mainly because there's a lot of illegitimate births. Because people were leaving behind those older traditional rural social controls of family or like religious oversight, and now with more independence, people are having relations more so than before and producing a lot more children. Because remember, like they weren't using good birth control methods, so here we are.
So really, they were just like, all right, mom and dad went to head out, and then just went wild.
Went wild, exactly. So this caused this was caused by a lot of low wages and breakdown of community controls too. So this is an outcome of the loosening of social controls that happened in places like England, France, German states, and Scandinavia. So a lot of this, where this happened was in England, France, German states, and Scandinavia. It hit its peak in Germany in 1850, where 25% of births were illegitimate. It hit its peak in Germany in 1850, where 25% of births were legitimate. 25% of births were illegitimate in Germany by 1850. On average, 10 to 20% of births in Europe became illegitimate. So in that 100-year time period, 10 to 20% of births were illegitimate. Meager economic opportunities were would basically allow single mothers to become desperate. So here's what's happening. Back when you had rural areas and people kind of living among their families, illegitimate births were not as uncommon, except what would happen was, because you had so much family pressure, if you got a girl pregnant, what would happen? They force you to marry her, right? So and so basically a lot of folks were having babies before they got married, or I should say getting pregnant before they got married, but when that occurred, they basically forced the two to get married. So it looks more legit, essentially, right? But now with all this independence and basically lack of oversight, and the fact that you're entering a period where people are making less money now, once they go to urban areas with their wages, men might say, yeah, I'm going to marry you, baby, or we're going to raise this family together. And because they couldn't produce enough wages, they basically couldn't.
Rolled out.
Exactly.
Oh.
This is the Missouri.
Exactly. It's exactly the time Les Miserables. Exactly.
We went from Lydia to the Missouri.
Exactly. All right. Causes of all this. So the rise in sexual activity among young people was one result because of loosened social controls that gave them more control over dating and having sex. And so because they lacked all that family oversight, they could yield more to their sexual desires. Many unwed mothers had sex on the promise of marriage. They were convinced to have sex because their boyfriend or whoever was like, yeah, I'll take care of you, baby. I promise I'll work hard for you, make all those wages. But fewer men begin to follow through by the late 1700s. So that's the problem. So fewer men begin to follow through.
Is